Our next speaker this morning is Michael LaFlash, HPP class of 2019. Michael is an associate at Heritage Consulting Group, having been with the firm for just over 2 years. Prior to starting with Heritage, Michael worked at the New Jersey SHPO. Michael's presentation this morning is titled Growing Diversity in Historic Tax Credit Projects. A common objection to historic preservation is that its actions favor the wealthy and that it advances gentrification. Today's industry, however, is actively pushing for the preservation of buildings and sites associated with minority and marginalized communities. One particularly effective method that ensures the stories of these buildings and people are told for generations to come is through state and federal historic tax credit programs. Over the past 2 years, Heritage Consulting Group has undertaken a significant number of projects that highlight this trend. Michael's presentation examines the growing diversity of rehabilitation projects using federal and state historic tax credits. With that, take it away, Michael.
All right. Hopefully everything comes through clearly here. So, no guarantees on my end. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michael, and everyone else for inviting me here today and for pulling this all together. A definite thank you and a big shout out to Zoe on her presentation before. Zoe is also a team member of the Heritage Consulting Group family. She's been a pretty vital member the last year and a half or so, interning with us throughout, all her thesis work and everything else. So kudos to her for taking on that extra work while dealing with Michael on a daily basis. We all know how fun that certainly is. As Michelle said, I've been working with Heritage Consulting Group for a few years now, where we specialize in historic tax credit projects. So this presentation will really kind of run through a lot of the projects that I have worked on in the last couple of years and what we're seeing in the industry, kind of growing out of that traditional and into a new phase of historic buildings. So just make sure that works. All right. So realistically, I'll just kind of run through, what the tax credit program is, and then shoot down through a couple of traditional projects that we're currently working on, and then showcasing some of the diversification that we're seeing, and then finalize with a bit of a look ahead. So a little background on Heritage. We are celebrating our 40th year this year, so that's all good fun. I note our offices because there's one that stands out among the rest. The Amesbury, Massachusetts office is brand new to our family. This is really the first time anybody has publicly stated that. So all good news. I got kicked out of Philadelphia, which was a lot of fun, and told to go home to Massachusetts. So we're all very excited about that. But like I said, we are a national consulting firm. We specialize in historic tax credit projects, but really work in a whole number of variety within the field. And so just to kind of jump into what the tax credit program really is, for those of you who may not know of it or be overly familiar with it, it offers a 20% tax credit to qualifying income producing buildings. The federal government began a tax incentives program back in '76, with the HTC, as we know it, really starting in '79 with some changes in '82 that really kind of pushed it to what we see now. But since that time, there's been over $116 billion in private investment on over 47,000 projects nationwide, as well as in Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, some other places. One day, hopefully, I will get a project any of those locations, and that will be quite a big splash. So in order to qualify to utilize the tax credits, a building must be listed in the NR. There are some loopholes around that, but for the most part, you kind of have to get listed in the NR to move forward. So that really leads into that 3-part process of the review. So the application includes a part 1, which is your evaluation of significance for buildings that are already contributing resources to listed historic districts. This is really your opportunity to just say that we retain integrity still, and it continues to convey the history of that district. For buildings that aren't listed yet, it's your chance to get a preliminary determination of eligibility. That's really your first step in the National Register nomination process as well, which kind of runs concurrent through the whole gamut here. The part 2 is where quite a bit of the fun happens, where you run through your description of the rehab work, the scope of work, defining how any changes to the building are going to impact the historic features. And then the part 3 is the request for certification of completed work. which is where you photograph the building and showcase that what you said you were going to do in the part 2, you actually did. So HTC projects were reviewed at SHPO and the MPS, going back and forth through kind of a review process between each. And then there are also many states, I think there's over 30 now, that offer a state HTC. New Jersey just enacted theirs this year. Their initial submission is actually next week, I think. So that's a brand new one to the party. So there's going to be quite a bit, hopefully quite a bit more of tax credit projects in New Jersey as a whole, which is going to be great for preservation there. So in terms of, you know, the history of the program in traditional HTC projects, there's really the original class, you know, which is the bread and butter work, where you can kind of sit down and have one quick overview of, you know, what are the MPS going to look to see when you submit your project work. You know, you can kind of guess pretty successfully where they're going to judge, you know, certain actions. You know, you're looking at mill buildings, old factories from the late 19th, early 20th century, downtown commercial buildings, specifically hotels. These three, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to work on these. They were all completed by Heritage before I joined the staff, but particularly the Adelphi Hotel in Saratoga is one that really drew me to Heritage Consulting Group. That's a place that I will gladly admit I've had a drink or two in my life, and certainly is something that, you know, is really a crown jewel of Broadway there in Saratoga. And I know we have some alumni that work very closely in that area, and I hope they too get to partake. But, you know, a couple other examples: Denver Union Station, which is really an entertainment hub, hotel, restaurant venue. And then the United States Lace Curtain Mill right down in the Hudson Valley, which is an affordable housing complex now. Believe live work unit for artists. So in terms of what we've worked on, or what I've worked on, fortunately, in my short time with Heritage, one that really stands out as a traditional project would be the Colt Armory in Hartford, Connecticut. This is a true landmark. It's an NHL and one of Hartford's really defining buildings and complexes. We completed the project in 2020 after 14 years of working on it. So as you can see from the Coltsville Historic District boundary map, the Armory complex right along the Connecticut River there, that's what we focused on. We didn't do any work with the workers' houses, and I believe Samuel Colt's home, Armsmere, is in this district as well, but we did not do any work there, unfortunately. It's a functionally related complex of 9 buildings constructed between 1855 and 1942. And you can kind of get a sense from what it is that we were able to transform this whole area into, using certain office spaces for schools. The garage up on Sequoia Street, letter O on this map, was turned into a gymnasium for the school. You know, that kind of transition from just old factory use into a brand new kind of living community here in right along the river in Hartford. I was lucky enough to come in at the very end and work on the third project right as it was kind of coming to a close. And I'll gladly take all the credit for all the great work that was done there, especially because the East Armory was involved, which has that wonderfully amazing blue onion dome that you can see from the highway as you cut through Connecticut, as you cut through Hartford. That area was turned into leasable commercial space, where there's also a mix of apartments and other, you know, retail, commercial, things of that nature that went on there. Other traditional ones that we're working on, the Steelbach Hotel in Louisville. This is one of Kentucky's more legendary hotels. It is renowned throughout the Commonwealth there. This rehab is ongoing. They are going to maintain the hotel use and carry forward that. So a lot of what they're working on with Steelbach right now are updating guest rooms and layouts to guest rooms. There's also a lot of good, fun new construction going on there, which is quite a bit of a challenge as you're looking at this right in downtown Louisville. Really adds for some challenge as you try to figure out how is the new construction going to interact with the historic, specifically from the primary points of view on, I want to say it's 4th Street and Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard there. But the best part about this project is the preservation and restoration of the 2 primary public spaces within the building. So the main lobby really speaks for itself in the grand staircase. from day one, the project team has kind of realized that no one's ever going to allow you to touch that. So we've done a great job of incorporating any kind of new circulation through there. Whereas the Rathskeller in the basement is one of the world's only examples of its type. It is a remarkable space when you get to see it in person. It is 100% made of pottery. And so everything you see from the colors and the artistry was all done during the kiln firing process. It still uses an event space. A lot of weddings, things like that are held in there. So both of those will really continue to be the crown jewel when the project gets closer to completion. This next one, a very traditional mill building, the Steel Heddle Manufacturing Company complex in Philly. This one has a lot of importance to the Heritage Company. Back in 2009, my bosses and colleagues worked on a potential project here, which resulted in its listing in the National Register. Unfortunately, that project never went anywhere, even though they had approvals for all the work they were trying to do. That was resurrected right around 2 years ago, right when I started. And we were able to kind of get back in there. We made it a Philadelphia landmark, it's on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places now. And we carried on with that. So the general idea is to rehab this into leasable commercial space, individual office units, things like that. The architect of this building is especially important. William Steele & Sons were prolific builders and designers in Philadelphia, especially. They were very, very early to the game in their use of concrete, in their application of concrete in industrial buildings. This comes a little later in their initial period, but you can kind of tell through their use of the concrete mushroom columns, concrete cap columns, the board form ceilings, the flooring, what the initial use of this space would have looked like. Through the project, all of that's going to remain, which is going to be great. So when you walk through this in a few years, when it's all said and done, there'll be corridors and new units, yes, but you'll see a lot of those columns maintained. You'll see that ceiling in full. The windows will match exactly what you're looking at there, which are the original windows. It'll really be something spectacular. So in recent years, though, we've kind of seen a push away from the traditional, a shift in the program that really highlights diversity. So it starts with the growing diversification in building types, moving into new uses of buildings, things like that, as well as a greater association with minority populations, women's history in particular, we work quite a bit with. And then there's also rehabs in general that are planned to benefit communities much more so than just, adding more apartments or adding new commercial space. So a lot of this, what we're seeing, the shift is due primarily to new building types reaching 50 years in age, right? The modern movement is now coming to an end in the 1970s. And so we're seeing a lot of those building types get into the forefront. And then you see as well a push from the National Park Service, specifically the NR division, and others in the industry, where they want to honor the past of those marginalized populations. One building type that is particularly important to me personally, this is the first building that I personally was able to list on the NR, and so it's something that I'll kind of always be a little proud of, is the Charleston Naval Hospital, just outside of the Charleston Navy Yard in South Carolina. This building was designed by Lyles, Bassett, Carlisle, and Wolfe, completed in '73, utilizing a few different forms of the modern movement architectural styles, whether it's brutalism, some new formalism in there, things of that nature, right? It's really a great example of the new architectural styles and how they're being listed, how they're being applied to tax credit projects. This one in particular is insanely challenging. They're trying to turn the hospital into multifamily apartments. And that's very challenging when you look at that first floor level. The plinth there has no windows whatsoever on it on all four sides. So in order to accommodate the necessary light requirements and fresh air requirements, you're not able to punch window holes into that space, right, to maintain its design. So we were actually able to get approvals to introduce open air courtyards through the roof of the plinth, which you can't see from any public rights of way. and therefore you can kind of get that light shown into one side of the apartment and meet your requirements from there. It's really interesting. I can't wait to see when they actually start construction on all of that and see how it's incorporated through. Another great example of a mid-century modern project that was just completed last year. This is Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey. It is, it's, for lack of better term, it's a monster of a complex. What you're seeing isn't even the full breadth of it. The site, landscaping, the two lakes that are there, the parking, all insanely important components and character defining features through this one. The interior has these large open air atriums that extend the full length of the building. So what you're seeing in this picture here is really just a fraction of that. But again, this is another great mid-century modern design. Eero Saarinen and Associates really speaks for itself. The challenges with this project, you know, really came down to the size of it, with nearly 2 million square feet there. In the end, there were over 100 tenant spaces between retail, restaurant, hotel, office, anything like that. Really challenging to make sure that you have every area is sympathetic to the building, is something that, you know, will meet the Secretary standards and carry on from there. You know, and in the end, we were able to make sure we retained those key features and kind of showcase those as central key components of the design. But the corporate campus type is we're seeing that more and more come through. This is a potential project actually that I just looked at down in Georgia, and this is called Corporate Square, designed between 67 and 72. You know, when we look into this, it's going to be kind of interesting to see, you know, can you list only one building within a corporate square complex? Do you need a district? Is there enough of a story to kind of tell everything from there? How important is the parking? How important is the landscaping in between the buildings? This is one that, you know, if we can get this to go forward as an HTC, we'd be very interested to see how the Park Service kind of rules upon these and continues to define the type. But not all of these that we're seeing are, you know, beautiful architectural designs or the work of masters like LBC and W or Saarinen. This one here, the Lexington Apartments and Motor Inns in Austin, Texas, is on the surface not exactly the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. It is an example of a chain motel from the 1960s. This one, as the rehab is ongoing, you know, we're looking at the character defining features here as well, right? It's brick and stone exteriors, it's central courtyard area, things like that. But telling the story and getting something like this listed is really where the challenge lies. We were able to get Part 1 approval on this one. We're still playing around with the remainder of the project. But a lot of this really tells the story of how you need to do the research and keep digging and digging and digging to find the true story. Because on the surface, this looks like it would never be considered eligible in any way. And so what that really led to for us, and you can see here between the two aerials, on the left from 1973 and on the right, a current aerial image, both showing the Lexington Apartments, it highlighted in red at the bottom. We found that the motel was designed to really hit on and take consumers and customers who were traveling at Austin's Robert Mueller Municipal Airport, which no longer exists really in any way, as you can see on the right. Austin built a new international airport south of the city around the 1990s that really transformed this area in the northern part of the city. And so we were able to figure out within a story a story that really highlights the significance of Robert Mueller Airport, as well as the commercial activity that developed around it. And the Lexington was really an important part of that, as motels historically weren't located in this section of the city, or hotels even weren't located in this section of the city. A great example of you know, how kind of the eye test, so you know, you can't really judge a book by its cover, really. But like I said, we're also looking at diverse stories. most of them that I personally have worked with deal with women's history. We are seeing other examples pop up. This example, the New Century Guild in Philadelphia, right in the heart of Center City, project just completed, actually not that long ago, right at the very end of 2021. The New Century Guild was a women's labor social society who really were instrumental in Philadelphia, especially in making sure that women's rights were maintained as they worked, a safe place for them to go as they moved to the city for work, things like that. This is a National Historic Landmark designated in the late 70s, I think. And so with this one, the NCG moved in there in 1906 and had their alterations to it. The rehab was took the building to become a boutique hotel. And rooms throughout really honor that past. They're named for women that played an integral role in the organization's history. There are photos all throughout that really honor those women in their past. The restoration of the building and the rehab of the building included a lot of woodwork, just to make sure that everything in a lot of these really high profile rooms, former sitting areas, really get showcased. The major challenge here in this project, oddly enough, was denied. And we were able to kind of resurrect that at the Part 3 process and get it approved. Was how do you put in an HVAC system in an area where the ceilings look like they do in both these pictures here? In the corridor areas, we were able to drop the ceilings down ever so slightly and kept them very tight to the HVAC equipment. And we're able to reinstall the trim work from there. So that way it really does not look like there's anything different about the building when you walk through it, when you look at your pre and post rehab photos. Another really amazing one, a very important project in Texas, is the Braniff International Hostess College building in Dallas. This building is a late 60s, 68 design that formerly housed the Braniff Airlines stewardess program, where the girls would come for their first job. They would live here and get trained on how to work on an airplane, and then they'd go off to service the Braniff family. And Braniff at that time was really pushing to make themselves a name in the airline industry, fighting with Pan Am and others. And you could tell here, they're trying to use flashy colors, things like that, to kind of set themselves apart. This was actually the very first NR listing in Texas under women's history, so social history for women's history. And the project really very kind of simple in its overall design, just to transition to multifamily apartments. But the cool part about this, as we went through the NR process, was really uncovering the history of this building and the program there. So the interior has a passion pit, which is where the women were able to entertain male guests. There are some very comical photos of people in there that unfortunately didn't come through very clearly. When you look at the building itself, the windows and the areas, those are enclosed, through fencing, kind of caged in areas, almost kind of like a go-go cage, a go-go dancing cage in some way there. I was having trouble getting good quality. Again, there are some photos of one class hanging out in this area of the building. It's really something different when you look at it. But then the interior spaces too, they had a model airplane room for them to go and train, where you had a half of an airplane, as you can see there in the bottom left. It was an area in a history lesson that realistically I don't think I ever would have learned about. So to run through this process was really something special. It's just kind of fun all around, telling that really 1960s kind of story. What we work in more often than not, though, with these diverse stories is the history of public housing. You could see two really good examples of the types of buildings that we really work with, both from El Paso. Sun Plaza on the top left, traditional kind of multifamily housing tower. And then Ray Sherman Place on the bottom right, a somewhat traditional multifamily complex, multi-unit buildings strewn throughout, all similar design types, all similar sizes. things of that nature. One of our favorite projects, this one is an all hands on deck, very interesting. Williamsburg Houses in Brooklyn really tells that story of early public housing history, slum clearance, New York City superblock developments. The rehab here is going to result in changes, updates, and finishes to all 20 buildings. At center is a public school, not involved in the project. But every building you see throughout this map, this image here, will be, new windows throughout, updated finishes in every apartment unit. It'll really look like something, it'll really bring it back to life when all is said and done. Another great example of that, Winton Terrace in Cincinnati. Both Winton Terrace and Williamsburg houses are PWA designs, PWA builds. The Cincinnati Metropolitan Housing Authority really wanted to move away from slum clearance in 1940, which is a pretty interesting part of the story here with this complex, as they pushed outside the city limits, or just at the very edge of the city limits, I should say, to design Winton Terrace. It's 93 buildings, and similar to Williamsburg houses, all 93 buildings will really get brought back to life. New windows, new finishes throughout. This rehab is just getting going, actually. So this will be a fun one, a nice long process here. But not all, again, relate to that history, that background on, early PWA designs, things like that. Both Audubon houses and Bethune houses are in Harlem, in New York City. They're both about a block away from each other, both very similar in design and style, constructed about 5 years apart from one another, but two insanely different stories. Audubon houses is multifamily, while Bethune is senior housing, but the story of Audubon was really fun to dig deep into, because in order to justify this significance, to tell this story for that building, we had to learn about vest pocket housing, which is really a transition type, especially in NYCHA's history, New York City Housing Authority's history, of where they go between superblock development more to an isolated, less destructive form of housing. A very, very interesting story on that front. Whereas Bethune was it couldn't be more different, where we focus solely on the history of elderly housing, the care for seniors, the need for housing for seniors, specifically in New York, the public act, the federal acts that led to the development of senior housing, and so on. Even though they look the same, again, the stories couldn't be more different. And so then that leads to diversifying rehabs that we've seen, really an opportunity to kind of be that economic driver that the program sets out to be. This is the Eastern Pumping Station in Baltimore, Maryland. This rehab is ongoing. You could see building 3 on the left is actually complete. That one is all ready to roll, but buildings 1 and 2 haven't even started yet construction-wise. Similar to a lot of those earlier industrial complexes that I showed, this one from the 1890s was a municipal water pumping station for this section of Baltimore. For those of you who frequently travel on Amtrak, cutting through Baltimore in that Northeast corridor, you do pass this. So if you want to keep your eyes open, you can kind of mark its transition as some of the other buildings get placed in service within the coming months. This rehab is really something special, though. They are looking to add leasable commercial space into each of these buildings, but all tenant space will be leased to minority-owned businesses, and they're all centered around the food industry. Catering companies, there's a gelato manufacturer in one, things like that. I know there are 2 bakers and some others. So the general idea of this rehab project is so that the community surrounding it has an opportunity to find work and to get trained in that industry, to then move on with additional work, move up the ladder and go from there, especially because the food industry does not require significant amount of high-level education or anything like that. It's certainly something that the project team is very proud of. They've had a couple of big opening galas, especially for building 3, that were huge successes in the city. Related new construction also took part there. And so as we look ahead at the future of the program, more and more buildings, associated with these minority communities are being listed. More or less every weekly list I look at has something from, the LGBTQ plus community, women's history, so on. That's particularly telling, especially the LGBTQ plus community, because a lot of the buildings that are associated with their history are already commercially based. So you can very easily start to transition and plan for some of those HTC projects as we move down the line. But as we get closer to the 2030s, and I know it's kind of a terrifying thought for a lot of us, we're getting closer and closer to buildings from the 80s being 50 years old, and therefore hitting that baseline eligibility requirement. Postmodernism will become a big play. We've actually had a couple of calls already on the James Thompson Center in Chicago about carrying forward a project on that. Nothing has moved forward, but that's a great example. I want to say the Thompson Center is from '86. But another great example of where we're going to be moving in the future. If anybody can ever talk the Walt Disney Company into utilizing tax credits, I think their entire facility is postmodernism from the 80s. And I'd certainly move out west for that purpose if that meant work there. So, but all in all, thank you for the time today. Hopefully, we can all kind of continue to push ahead in the tax credit industry and continue to do some great work.
Thanks, Mike. Sounds like Heritage Consulting is doing a lot of really interesting and important work to breathe new life into these a really broad range of buildings. So that's very exciting to see.
Yeah, it's the fortunate thing about working with a national firm more than a local or anything like that is plus I never traveled in my life either, so I've been very fortunate to see a lot of towns and cities, places I honestly never thought I'd want to be, let alone knew existed. Gastonia, North Carolina, even bigger cities like Birmingham, Alabama, places like that I honestly never thought I'd ever hit. But there's just a great grouping of people everywhere you go and great buildings to see each time.
Very cool. Looks like we've got a couple of questions here in the chat, starting off with, let's see, Rachel has a question. Ray Sherman Place, or she has a question about Pioneer Homes in Syracuse. Rachel.
Yeah, it's not really a question. It's a rhetorical question because, I saw a tax credit presentation with the Park Service that was on the Sherman homes. I used to work at the Texas SHPO. And, it's so obvious that there's a lot of public housing from that era. And so here in Syracuse, our Pioneer Homes is of that era. The changes to the roof and the little porch additions, all of that can just be taken right off and be a great tax credit project. They can enlarge some of those interior spaces, the bedrooms, and it would still work. It's just a matter of there's no political will for that. They just want to erase the site and throw it in the dump. And so, enjoy. But there's just no way I can even get an audience with the people in Syracuse to let them know that projects like this happen all the time. That you can get sites, neighborhoods where people have been living for decades, and they can easily be done. They just don't want to do it here.
It's really interesting to see the different communities that really embrace it. Certain cities are ahead of the curve with that. In Philadelphia, especially, they also don't really have much of a desire to even entertain the RAD program, conversion, which is really where it's necessary to kind of get it out of the public's hands to make it income producing. But certain cities in New York, NYCHA is really picking up on this now. 10 years ago, they would have never even entertained the thought. And so now they're really getting into it. And so a lot of the question is, what's going to be the domino effect with once NYCHA starts publicizing it, right? Will other cities follow suit, things like that? And that's really the hope, right? Because there's a lot of great stories to tell from Syracuse to Los Angeles and anywhere in between. So the hope is there, at least.
I guess while I have my mic on, the other thing I would ask is, I had commented that Alexander Gerard did the interiors for the Braniff chain. Yeah. And I mean, he is a world-renowned interiors person. The colors were fantastic. The stewardesses' costumes, all of that. I mean, he made those planes look fantastic. And I was just wondering if in your project, is your client wanting to do anything to bring back those bold colors and whatnot and have a little fun in that interior space?
Yeah, I actually haven't seen much discussion on the interior color choices or anything. Mostly, just the layout changes at this point, and I mean overall finishes, but nothing too specific as we get into it. I think that's certainly in the works, but I personally haven't seen it yet, which is a bit of a shame because I know, I mean, imagine seeing something like that Passion Pit really brought back to life, or something along those lines, where you can really embrace the history. And I mean, you see it in airports across the country who have display cases set up for these historic airlines, right? Tampa in particular has a great walkway where you can see Braniff stewardess outfits. You can see Pan Am. You go right on down the list. It's really something special.
Yeah, he did the Miller House in Columbus, Indiana. He did that interior for Saarinen, and it's just spectacular. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Looks like Susanna was wondering what the Harlem properties are going to be rehabbed for.
So those will be maintained as affordable housing now. So that's all part of the RAD assistance program, where they're kind of shifting from public run entities to more of private management, but still the affordable housing. So it'll continue to be used for that, which is, always necessary across the board.
Looks like we also have.
Can I ask a?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah, go for
I
it.
wanted to ask just a quick follow-up to that. Then I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
I think it gives us great projects and a lot to think about. And yes, Philadelphia, it's not a leader. Sorry to say. We do our best, but not there yet. I'm just
they're happy to
curious.
stay in their ways there.
I'm just curious with projects like the one in Harlem in particular, where it's will continue to be for low-income housing. Do you deal with other federal programs? And so do you have sometimes you have competing interests to try and get these tax credit projects through? I've encountered that on some of my projects. I was just curious.
It's challenging, right? Especially the low-income housing tax credits, and when you twin the two, they're really remarkable what you can do in the end, but the two don't always line up together. They have their own necessary requirements and timelines and schedules. And the HTC, for what it does, and it's great in its own right, can kind of combat with the LIHTC because of that, right? Where the review processes may interact with one another in a way that, your LIHTC investors dislike entirely. It's certainly its timing becomes the primary issue I've seen. Not so much in terms of, finishes or anything like that. They seem to blend very well there. And for a lot of the developers who twin the two together, the two credits, they become very well versed in how to do that and how to use the system. So it's certainly something that we see, it works very successfully a lot, but it can certainly have its, challenges.
Yeah, I was wondering if it had been getting any better. It's kind of the meshing of the two.
Yeah, yes and no. I think people are more practiced in it, which is really, I think just the more that, developers, consultants, whoever it is, are working through the two together, especially when you get architects who specialize in both, then it's a very smooth transition.
Interesting. Thanks.
Thank you.
It looks like we have one more question from Jessica Flynn, who is new to the field. And she is curious about the intent to make these older buildings functional for modern society while maintaining outer facades, or are you trying to keep as much of the original building as possible?
Yeah, it's really a specific project by project basis there. The intent of the program is to keep and maintain the character defining features, to maintain those primary spaces while breathing new life into them, right? So a lot of these, especially when it comes to the mill buildings, right? They haven't been used in decades. you know, you're able, even though you're subdividing former industrial spaces that would have been open, you still get to see a lot of that historic fabric, the wood floors, the, you know, the exposed ceiling structure, the exposed columns, and so on. So a lot, it's kind of an interplay between the two. You could certainly have certain developers who are much more gung-ho on having the design their way, and that can cause a lot of fun challenges as you kind of walk them through the system in the program. But yeah, the general intent is to, so that way, you know, when you look at a building, you can very easily see what its historical use or significance is, while also saying, hey, that's, you know, a functioning taxable property within a community.
All right, it looks like Michael's got a question as well.
Mike, great presentation. I agree with you completely. If you've done Tax Act with low-income housing tax credits on more than one occasion, you get to know the necessary elements of the capital stack have to do with the timing, because the low-income housing tax credit becomes available at the end of the project, whereas the equity up front is what it is the Tax Act is providing you with. And the architects, as you said, that have done this and are familiar with it have no difficulty with it. More particularly, the developers that I've worked with will embrace it if they have experience with it. But as I've been working so much in the last few years with the Baker real estate program, I've understood what the requirements for the capital stack are, and those have changed. So I have a two-part question for you. And it, again, has to do with my own experience. I am old enough to have rehabbed the same building 3 times, right? All by use of the Secretary of Interior standards. This would be interesting for Sherry Freer, who's on the call, because not everybody will admit that National Register properties have been rehabbed by the Secretary of Interior standards 3 times. But the point here is that the financial arrangements from 79, which you correctly identified as have changed. The low-income housing tax credit, of course, was introduced in 76 as well, right? But even the provisions for that have changed. And I know from my friends in real estate, what has happened is the nature of finance from the private sector has changed considerably because the foreign investment has increased so remarkably that there's far more money than there has been in any number of forms for investment. The students that I have from the Baker program who are investment counselors in other parts of the world tell me where it is the money is coming from. And the reality is it's not simply by virtue of the indirect, but rather the direct funding that is available by virtue of the capital stacks that are being assembled. Now, question for you. What, if any, changes have you seen in the nature of the finance in the projects that you have encountered? Or is anybody in the firm tracking that? It would seem to be that it would be outside the scope of your responsibilities because the project itself would be done at a certain point of time. But the flip side of the question is you will get a hint of this by virtue of the nature of the projects which are being financed, which seem rather unusual.
Yeah, I think it's a little beyond what we look at specifically. Every once in a while, someone will come with that information, or we'll see the pro formas in place or anything like that, right? But for the most part, a lot of what we see with the changes in the financing is the impact that splitting the credit out over the course of 5 years has had, and in the limits that's in the changes that's made to the cost and the price of the credit through investment. That's been the most
Right.
impactful we've seen, at least, internally discussed, just based off of what we handle.
Okay. Now, the other thing that is related, and I've done this, I think I've shown you projects where I've done this when you were a student here. I have separated legally the parcel, the National Register property, into 2 parcels with different kinds of financing, right? And by virtue of separating with treating the National Register property as one property, but putting together legal frameworks that allow a financial advantage from different parts of the financial stack, does seem to work on an ongoing basis, because then those things are seen as assets and they can be bought and sold independently, still honoring the register. Any thoughts about that?
With the functionally related guidance, it's kind of tough, right? It's all about ownership and what's going on each parcel individually.
Yes.
So
Right.
it's a matter of is any work going to be taking place on one versus the other? If you want to break it into multiple projects, which is
Yes.
pretty similar to what we've done. Actually, the Baltimore example, the building number 3 has full Part 3 approval, so that project is over.
Right.
It's completely done. The other buildings we broke out into a separate project, so that project is now what's ongoing, and they can then reap the rewards of claiming credits on one versus the other, right? So it enables new investment to come in, while kind of playing the game that way. But it's more about when you separate the parcels out, it's more about what's the ownership, playing the game with the functionally related guidance.
Yep.
Do you have a year gap in construction, things like that,
Right.
that you're getting into a lot of the nitty gritty on. But yeah, you certainly see how beneficial that can be, but also challenging, because if work is going to be taking place while a project is going on, does that impact your status on your project, right?
Yep.
If work is happening on a different building or a different side of the property.
Well, thank you again. If we have the opportunity, it'd be great to put this presentation into a written form for distribution at some point.
More than happy for that.
I think I was thinking as you were lecturing that I'm glad to have this as a YouTube, because I can use it in the economics and finance course. Thank you.
Yeah, it's certainly, the tax credit field and the consulting work that's done there, it hits on like 90% of what we learn in every class. So it's, how do you take every aspect of the lessons we learned and put it into practice, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
It's certainly beneficial to move on with that, but been a great couple of years. So all good fun.
All good fun.
And
Thank you.
I think Joseph asked what my background photo was. That's Worcester, Massachusetts Union Station. It is probably the first rehab project in Worcester that sparked a whole ton of other rehabs in the area back in like 2001. It's a dream project of mine, that's for sure. If anything ever changes in there.
I think maybe before we jump into too many more questions, I'm going to call for a pause so we can take a break before our next presentation. If anybody wants to join us again in a few minutes, Jeff Yolinoni will be. Thanks for a great presentation, Mike.
Thank you.